if I'm going to say that Jesus is my brother, if I'm going to say that God is my father, if I'm going to say that heaven is my home, then I have to say that Mary is my mother. That Jesus and I were, in a sense, born from the same womb. That Jesus and I are in the same family, at the same table, in the same place, and we both look to her.
G'day everyone and welcome to the Thomas More Center channel. My name is Mark Makiewicz and today it's my pleasure to be interviewing Mike Aquilina. Mike is the Executive Vice President and co-founder of the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. Mike, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having me on today, Mark.
Thanks so much for coming. So there's a fascinating background to you, which I discovered after we'd even booked this interview, which is your relationship with Dion DiMucci. Is that how you pronounce his surname?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so Dion and the Belmonts. If anyone knows Runaround Sue, that's him. So, Mike, in 2000, you ran into Dion on a pilgrimage in Rome. Can you tell us more about the circumstances of this meeting and the friendship that grew out of it?
Well, we were on a pilgrimage together, and we both gave talks on the pilgrimage, and I got to know him pretty well over the meals and on the bus and that sort of thing. I got to know both him and his wife, Susan, and we stayed in touch after the pilgrimage and got to know each other very well. So 2011 rolls around, and there's a publisher after him to write a memoir, and he said he'd do it, if I would do the project with him. So I did, and we got to working on it, and then after the project, he dared me to write a song. And so I wrote a song, and he loved it. Next day, he asked me to write another one, and we started writing music together, and we've been writing music together ever since then.
Okay. And you didn't really have a songwriting background. You did play in a band, I believe, but was this kind of, I understand you studied poetry when you were younger. Was it your poetry kind of coming into action?
I think so. We played in a garage band when we were in high school. I played in a garage band when I was in high school. Dion was already a star when he was in high school. But yeah, I played around, and then I did study poetry in college, and so I guess all of that feeds into it. These are skills that are latent, and they're in there waiting to be used.
Uh-huh. And so it's my understanding that since you met Dion, you've now written songs that have been sung by Paul Simon, Van Morrison, Bruce Springsteen, amongst others.
Yes, we have.
Can you tell us how all that got arranged?
Well, I guess the first one that got out there was New York Is My Home, which Dion wrote. We wrote together as a love song to his city, and so he wanted to get another New Yorker to sing with him. So he asked Paul Simon, and Paul Simon gladly did it, and gradually got obsessed with the song, and eventually produced the final version himself, just so he could put more into it. It's a beautiful production that he did. So we worked with him again on Song for Sam Cooke, which is a song reminiscing about the tour that Dion made with Sam Cooke back in the early 60s. With the others, Dion invited Bruce Springsteen's wife to sing on a couple of the albums that we've done together. And she said yes. And whenever she said yes, he's kind of come along just for the fun of it and played guitar and harmonica on the songs that we were recording. That's fun. Van Morrison, same thing. Dion has an old friendship with him and was able to call him into one of our projects. And you go down the list, and this is how it happens over and over again. A lot of these people, they kind of grew up together, and they stayed in the business together. They stayed in touch. They often work together, and they're still working together today.
So, going from your friendship with Dion back about 1700 years, you've written a book called Friendship and the Fathers. I was hoping you could tell us something about what the fathers said on this subject, and what do you think is the great impediment to friendship today?
Hmm. Well, they said a lot on the subject. What I was observing in the book is that friendship seems to have been uh, the main program, if there's a program for evangelization in the early church. Right, there were no electronic media. They couldn't do what you and I are doing now. Talk across the world in real time. They had no there were no such media. The media they had access to were the public square, the marketplace. And if you stood out in the marketplace, if you stood out in the forum and you started speaking about Christianity, well, you could be executed the next day, because the practice of Christianity was a capital crime. So you didn't do that. Well, how did Christianity spread? Because we know it spread at a remarkable rate. The sociologist Rodney Stark just observes that Christianity grew at a steady rate of 40% per decade through those first 3 centuries, when it was illegal, when it was a capital crime, when it had everything going against it. No media at all. So what was the medium, so to speak, for evangelization? It was friendship. You made friends with the people next door. You made friends with the people who were in the market stall next to yours, in the forum, in the marketplace. This is how Christianity spread from one person to another, from one household to another, and I think that's worthy of study, and I think it's worthy of imitation. You find it active in the works of the fathers, and one I always recommend to people is is a little red book called The Octavius by Minucius Felix. It's a book probably written in the late 100s. So we're talking about the very early history of Christianity. And it describes a vacation weekend spent by 3 lawyers, Roman lawyers, in the resort city of Ostia, the port city of Ostia. And it shows what they did through that holiday, and what came of it. And they went in, and 2 of them were Christian, one of them was a pagan. And when they came out, all 3 were Christians. So it kind of tracks the conversion of one of their members, and it's a remarkable document. And I think it's a window into that world, because this must have been the way that most conversions happen, through conversion, through frank conversation.
Mhm. It would still be the template today, wouldn't it? I mean, evangelization works most effectively when you've established a friendship with someone. It's not so much hearing the word preached cold. It's being warmed up through conviviality and whatnot. So
I
yeah,
think
no,
so.
there's certainly lessons we can learn, especially in this day and age when we supposedly have so many friends online, but very few bosom
I,
buddies, you might say.
Yeah, and I
Mm.
think friendship is really ground zero for evangelization, and that's what I wanted to show by collecting these texts from the early church. That this is the way it happens. You asked about impediments to friendship. Well, one thing is that we don't leave our homes as much. We can live in the suburbs, and we could be surrounded by people, and we don't know their names. We tend to have the garage door in this country. If you live in the suburbs, the garage door goes up in the morning, and you leave and you go somewhere else to work, right? And then you
Mm.
come back in the evening, the garage door goes up and it closes behind you, and you go into your car and you don't emerge until the next morning. And on the weekends, well, then you have your social life, and your social life is something you've carefully curated, right, with people who are elsewhere. So you go and you do things somewhere else. You get in your car and you do it. And we don't have as much contact, everyday contact with human beings, people around us, people who might need to hear what we have to say. If we're only looking for like-minded people, in our friendships, well, then we're not evangelizing.
Yeah.
In the ancient world, if you wanted news, if you wanted goods, if you wanted water, you had to leave the house, right? You had to leave the house in the morning. And when you left the house, you had conversation. You had conversation with the people around you. You were vulnerable, right? And you had to put yourself out there day after day after day, because people would ask you questions about your life. That's evangelization. It takes place in the context of friendship. There were more opportunities for that kind of evangelization in the ancient world. I think we have to make opportunities for it today.
Mm. So, could you give us some examples of how we can make those opportunities? Because they're not so apparent to us, I suppose. It's not as obvious anymore about how we can kind of seek after such friendships.
Well, I, I think it's by letting people know we're available, and if you bring people cookies at Christmas time, they're usually happy to get cookies, right? And then you have a conversation, you have a little conversation, and if you tell them, if you ever need anything, just let me know. I'm right next door, and I'm happy to help. That's just something simple to say, but it really means something, because one day they might need something in a hurry.
Mhm.
Their car might not start. They might need a ride somewhere, and you can extend charity at that time. And these are opportunities that are the beginning of evangelization. I do not advocate going in and beating people with the Bible. I do not advocate going in and splashing people with holy water. You don't have to lead with the mysteries of Christianity. The early Christians tended not to, right? You don't see the cross very much in Christian art, because there were certain things they considered to be mysteries, and that you had to ramp up to. You had to uh, build up to. You had to lead people into knowledge of these things. And I think that that's generally the case today too. People have to come to see the effects in your life, uh, and then those effects in your life, the charity that you're showing, that you're extending, those are the things that prepare people to receive the gospel, and make them open to it when they hear it.
Mhm. In your book, you talk about the friendship of two fourth century fathers, Saint Basil and Saint Gregory. So they were best friends from school, and then they fell out, and then they had that friendship restored. I was wondering if you could just tell us that story.
Well, yeah, you told the story right there. They were friends in school, and through their friendship, they really egged each other on in the spiritual life, in the ascetical life. Okay, they lived together as undergraduates, and they kept a disciplined life of study and of prayer, right, and of fasting and all of the other traditional Christian disciplines. And they grew very close. They both were brilliant men, and they both developed their skills, kind of iron sharpening iron. They developed these together. Uh, and that's something to see. Now, their skills were very different, and their temperaments were very different. Okay, Basil was a great organizer, and he was a great leader. Gregory was a poet. He was an extreme introvert, and Gregory was also a great theologian. Basil was a good theologian too. So I mean, they were good for each other. They complemented each other. Well, Basil eventually, through his leadership skills, through his organizational skills, as an administrative skills, rose to become bishop of Caesarea, and and he realized that the church was in a crisis. That Arianism, which was supported by the emperor and by many of the mid-level governmental figures, was taking over. And he was alarmed by this, because people were falling away from true faith in Jesus Christ and coming to think that Jesus was simply a creature. You know, it it's a it's a kind of a corrosion of the central doctrines of Christianity, the Trinity and the Incarnation. Essentially, it denies both, and Basil could see that, and he could see that once Arianism took hold, you lost Christianity, you lost the essence of Christianity. So he fought against it, and he saw that he just needed a lot of allies in this. So he ordained his good friend Gregory to be a bishop in a nearby see, and Gregory felt he was pressured into this. He felt resentful of it over time, and their relationship became strained. It was kind of passive aggressive, especially on his part, and still, he served faithfully, and he did great things. It was Gregory who kind of put the final nail in the coffin at the Council of Constantinople, and he was the great thinker who articulated Trinitarian doctrine, and also the doctrine of the Incarnation through his amazing works. But the relationship was wounded in this in this development. uh, they never quite fully reconciled, and Gregory recognized that afterwards. I think he had a lot of pain as a result of it, a lot of regret as a result of it, and he confronted it very frankly in his eulogy to Basil after he died. And it's one of the greatest tributes to a friend that anyone has ever delivered, ever written, and we can be grateful for that. It's a it's a beautiful tribute to friendship in general as well, and what friendship can do to develop one's Christianity, to develop one's faith, one's spirituality, one's gifts from God.
In one of your books, you discuss the evangelization of 12 ancient cities. And I'm a huge fan of John the Evangelist. And so I was hoping you could give us a brief history of Ephesus and how it came to be evangelized.
Well, I talk about Ephesus as a port city because that's just a natural way that cities begin. You know, they're on the coast. You eventually build yourself a good harbor, right, by digging it out with slave labor, and you just make yourself available to the world. And especially in the first century, that was a great thing to be, right? That was there were just endless opportunities. Caesar Augustus had just brought peace to the world by taking over the world, really, by making it all part of the Roman Empire. There, trade on the open seas was happening for the first time because of the discovery of the trade winds. You have another project of Augustus is a system of roads all over the world that could be conductors for goods and services, and also the gospel. So all of these things happened, as a ramp up to the first century. And then in the first century, you have these cities, these Greek cities thriving, and Ephesus is one of them. Ephesus was already, of course, an important city in the world. It was the home to one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the temple to Diana, to Artemis, and so it had a lot of religious tourism going on as well. People would go there on pilgrimage. They would go to the temple, and they'd buy little tchotchkes, little souvenirs, just like we do today when we go to Rome or Israel or Lourdes or Fatima or wherever, right? We buy little souvenirs to show that we were there. And people would do that. And what happens is, in the first century, as we read in the Acts of the Apostles, St. Paul goes to Ephesus, and he starts to draw people into Christianity, which means you're drawing them away from idolatry. And people don't want to buy the little silver tchotchkes anymore. They don't want to buy the little images of Diana for their home. And so the silversmiths protest against this, and their protest grows, and it almost becomes a riot. Now, the title of the book you mentioned, my book, is Rabbles, Riots, and Ruins. And I tried to show how these events, right, that usually began with a simple public conversation, became something much bigger, and often were key events in the growth and the history of Christianity. That these rabbles caused riots, and the riots often led to this public conversation or a public display of devotion that would impress other people. So that happened in Ephesus, and we can see it in the Acts of the Apostles. There's a great fear among the authorities that this is going to become a riot. If it does become a riot, then the military comes in and suppresses it, and there are terrible consequences for the citizens. We can see that all through antiquity. In my book, Rabbles, Riots, and Ruins, I tell the stories of many, many riots.
You've said that the Christians civilized the Roman Empire by virtue of their countercultural treatment of women, children, and the poor. What was it that the Christians were doing so differently?
Well, there were a couple of important ideas that played into it. One was the idea of human dignity. All right. And this is an idea that we take for granted today, that of course, every human matters, and there's universal human dignity. We take that for granted. It's one of the pillars of Western civilization and all that stuff. So even in non-Christian countries, you'll find people kind of mouthing these pieties. Um, but it was not a universal. It was not a given in the ancient world. And as Tom Holland, the historian Tom Holland, demonstrates in his history, Dominion, that was a cruel world. It was a very cruel world, and it could be it could provide a good life if you had a lot of money, and it could, and probably would, provide an awful life if you didn't have a lot of money. Um, he opens his book with a description of a crucifixion taking place in Rome in the first century, and it's a pretty awful thing. And then he goes on to explain that crucifixion was a very common form of torture and execution in that period, and he gives you a little history of crucifixion. It was nasty in ways that we can't imagine today. It was legal to kill a slave. It was legal to rape a slave. It was something that went unpunished and was not considered a crime until the Christian era. So it was a pretty awful world. And these things were baked into the laws. So Christianity came along with ideas like human dignity, human rights, human equality, right? This idea that we're all equal before God. That was not part of the makeup of the ancient world. And from all of these ideas came other ideas like morality on the battlefield. What was it right to do on the battlefield, and what was it wrong to do on the battlefield? And we're still working out these questions today. Remember, the eradication of slavery, or the near universal rejection of slavery is a fairly recent phenomenon. So we're still working out these things today. But we're working them out because of ideas that were introduced by Christianity. I don't think any of these things are possible without Christianity, and it's very interesting to see this new phenomenon now, where there's been an increase of books by non-believers who appreciate the role that Christianity has played in the history of ideas, because we don't have these good things without them. And really, that's the bottom line of books like Rodney Stark's The Rise of Christianity. Stark wrote it as an agnostic, but he wrote it because he was appalled by developments in culture, in society, about the increasing violence, all of these things. And he feared that we were receding from Christianity and becoming pagan once again. That's why he wrote The Rise of Christianity. And Tom Holland had similar motivations in his book Dominion, which is a history of ideas, and he lays them out and he shows the development of ideas since the beginning of Christianity's eclipse during the Enlightenment, and he's showing what happens then, right? And he says the only two honest people in the last several hundred years are the Marquis de Sade and Friedrich Nietzsche, because they recognized that what happens if there is no God, right? And specifically, if there's not the Christian God. So I think there is an appreciation for this. You have this phenomenon of conversions now of people from agnosticism and atheism. You have Richard Dawkins calling himself a cultural Christian because he sees that the alternatives maybe are radical Islam or wokeism, and he doesn't want either of those, right? Who wants either of those? Some people do, I guess, but most people don't.
Yeah, I think there's a real, it's becoming more and more obvious that when your Christian underpinnings are gone, we really do descend into dark places. And sadly,
everything's about power.
Yeah. Sadly, it only seems to be now, as it's almost seems too late for at least parts of the West to recover it, that it's being recognized what we had. But what are your hopes? I suppose we should always be hopeful as Christians, but how do you see this turning around in the West?
God is full of surprises. That's something I know from reading history, right? And if you read history, you see that again and again, the church, in Chesterton's word, has died. right? It's been all but dead. It's been given up for dead. And even people within the church have been on the brink of despair because they could not see a solution. But a great surprise was just around the corner every single time. People just couldn't see it. And I think that there are great surprises around the corner, things that we can't imagine, right? Because we think in terms of what we know, and what we know is the past, right? So we expect the past to repeat itself in exactly the same way, and that doesn't happen. We get surprises, and we see so many of the institutions that we love falling apart, and we don't want them to go because we know that they were the glue in society. But God may be uh, giving us something better, providing for something better. We can be sure that church history turns on the lives of the saints. There's a great book. It's almost by that title. It was a textbook from the early part of the last century. I think it was called Church History Through the Lives of the Saints. And what it showed was that the canonized saints, the saints we know, were the ones who changed history, who remade the world when it needed to be remade. That's a great way of looking at history. But I tend to think that more often history turns on the lives and the prayers of saints whose names we never know. Anonymous saints, these humble Christians who are living in neighborhoods like mine, and who are praying to God earnestly. These widows living alone, they're often the ones who are shown to us as the ones who draw miracles from Jesus, or are the icons of faithfulness in Jesus' parables. So I think that's the way history turns. And when we see history from the point of judgment, that we're going to see some surprises. We're going to see that history did turn, not so much on the actions of presidents and kings and generals, not so much on the actions of popes and bishops and monsignors, but very humble people, humble Christians asking for favors from God, and asking out of sincere love and desire. I'm ready for anything that comes. I hope I am. I hope I'll be open to the new things that God wants to introduce into the world. I hope that I'll be faithful to the old things that God has given. And it's always a balancing act. It's always an act of discernment in every generation.
Yeah, it strikes me God's, I wouldn't say sense of humor, but God's way of doing things. We'll find out that some of the greatest saints that ever lived were never canonized in our
Yes,
time.
yes.
They'll be revealed, their glory is to be revealed later on. In terms of cultural renewal, you're involved in patristics, and this was recognized, the need to go back to the sources, the well springs of the faith, back to scripture, back to the fathers, has been something in play for, getting on to 100 years. For those watching, what's the importance of studying the fathers today?
First of all, I want to say that they're entertaining. All right, that I really do enjoy reading the works of the fathers and reading the lives of the fathers. And I don't think that's such a weird thing. If you look around you, if you think about your friends, especially people who are my age and older, you find that so many people are fascinated by genealogy, right? And they spend money to have their DNA done because they want to know where they came from. And they're willing to spend all this time in research and doing their family tree on websites and that kind of thing, because they want to know who they are. So they want to know, what made them this way. And I think that's what is satisfied when we read the fathers. We find out who we are, who made us this way, what made us this way. And that plays out in so many ways. You think about this television series, The Chosen, right, which purports to show the scenes of the Gospels in ways that are relatable. What The Chosen has done is give people an imaginative entry into a world that was otherwise inaccessible to them. And it's a world that's very important to their lives. They know that, okay, because they have some residual Christianity in them, so they're drawn to this. What is it, that made Christianity? What is it that made me? And so you watch these television shows and you get your imaginative entry into that world. I have written all of my books. I've written more than 70 books now, and I've written all of those books to provide an imaginative entry into the world of the ancient church, an imaginative entry into the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century, because people want to know that world, and they're willing to read those books. If they had not been willing to read those books, I never would have written a second book about the Church Fathers, but I've written more than 70. That shows market demand. My publishers aren't stupid, right? They bring out the books that people want to read, and I've been doing this now for more than 30 years. Reading the Fathers excites me because it brings me into that world, that ancient world that preceded me in time and made me who I am. That's the definition of a father, according to the early Jewish rabbis. Someone who precedes us in time and makes us who we are. We want to know our fathers. We want to know our ancestors. So I delight in going back into that world.
May I ask who your favorite church father is and why?
On most days, it's Ignatius of Antioch. And I love him because he's very early in the history of the church. Ignatius is someone who knew the apostles, right? So he sets his letters down in 107 AD. His letters were very well known in the history of the early church, and he was revered by the later fathers. So we know these are authentic. And the letters are full of this intense, beautiful devotion to Christ. You really feel that he is someone who knows Jesus, who loves Jesus, and is eager to imitate Jesus, who's been utterly transformed by the gospel, and who wants you to be transformed too. So he left us 7 letters, and he was on his way to his execution. He lived in Syria, but he was going to be executed in distant Rome. So he had to travel across land and sea to get there. And of course, there were many stops along the way. You can imagine that the military personnel who took him along the way, sorry about that, I talk with my hands, but the military personnel who took him along that way would drag him out in these various cities, and they would kind of display him, hoping that he would cower in fear as they described the punishments that he was about to endure. But he showed courage in all of those places, and he wrote letters to encourage the various churches along the way. And we have those letters today, and they show us so much. What do they show us? They show us a church that looks like my parish in the 21st century, for better and for worse, okay? He shows the same kind of conflict you're going to see in a typical parish today. But he also shows the same kind of structure. He shows that in a local church, there's bishop, priests and deacons, right? They're the ones who are the hierarchy of the church, so to speak. He shows that the early church believed in the true and full divinity of Jesus Christ and the true and full humanity of Jesus Christ, that those things were bedrock from the very beginning. He shows that the church was centered on the Eucharist and believed the Eucharist to be the flesh of Jesus Christ, as he put it, the very flesh that was crucified and raised for my salvation. That's how he described the Holy Eucharist as it was celebrated in his church during his time. And remember, he was a very old man when he went to his death in 107 AD. He describes the Eucharist as the blood of God. The blood of God, God's blood. These are very stark, realistic, evocative terms that we can look at today and really enjoy as part of a Eucharistic revival as we're experiencing here in the United States. I love the letters of Ignatius of Antioch because they show me this place that's distant, not only geographically but chronologically, a church that's far from my own and yet is so much like my own. I can see the connection, the Catholicity of the church, which means the universality of the church, not only through space but also in time, that I can share the same faith with someone like Ignatius of Antioch, 2,000 years old now, uh, uh, but uh, but also from a land distant from mine, and using a language different from mine, and a culture and in a society different from mine. This is the richness of the Catholic faith, and I love it.
Yeah. So one kind of detail that you brought up was, how the Romans would treat the prisoners as they were on their way to Rome. What kind of I can't get my head around is that they let them write letters. Do you know anything about
The kind of treatment that we see St. Paul getting in the Acts of the Apostles, or the kind of treatment that we see Ignatius getting, was reserved for special cases, right? People who were celebrities somewhat and who decided to make an issue of something, people who had the ability to make an issue of something. And we see that Paul does this by showing that he's a citizen, a Roman citizen, which was a rare privilege in his time, and invoking that privilege in order to make an appeal to the emperor. That was his right. They had to respect it. And they could see that Paul was something of an important figure because he caused riots, right? And people were intensely concerned about his well-being, or that they wanted to bring an end to his well-being. So Paul is one case. Ignatius is another case. Historians often raise the question about why was Ignatius tried in Syria and executed in Rome? And it's not as if he was doing what Paul was doing. He wanted no appeal. As a matter of fact, he asks the Romans to make no appeal on his behalf, do nothing to prevent the execution of his sentence, because Ignatius wanted to die the way Jesus died, tortured, humiliated, publicly. He wanted that. He wanted to be like Jesus to that degree. He wanted that kind of perfect communion. As a matter of fact, he used the language of communion to describe his impending death. Right? He describes his flesh as Eucharistic for the lions, right? And he says, he asks that God make him pure wheat, so that he'll be like the Eucharistic bread. He asks only that he be poured out like a libation upon the sand in the Colosseum. So Ignatius is being transported because he's a celebrity and because they want to make an example of him, right? But they still had to recognize that he had rights, right? And so they gave him some degree of freedom to write letters. Why not, right? Let him write letters to his family or to whoever. They just didn't see that as a big threat. They thought that the greater advantage they were gaining by taking Ignatius from one place to another was by instilling fear in people, by talking about his impending fate and how inevitable it was. They thought that would be a greater deterrent for Christianity. This is still the first generation after the generation of the apostles. So this whole idea that came along later through observation of recent experience was that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. But I don't think anybody was saying that in the first century. They were learning that, but they were only beginning to learn it.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of people focus on the fathers, but you've also focused on the mothers of the church. Can you tell us a bit about their contributions and also who your favorite mother is?
Their contributions were incalculable, and that's partly so because women did not leave the kind of footprint that men left in the ancient world. They didn't have access to the public the way men did. But it's through Christianity that begins to change. And we see that through these women who are writers, who are teachers, who are who hold a prominent place within the church. Okay, and that's happening from very early on. We see that some of Paul's companions, we see in the canonical scriptures that some of Paul's companions were women. In the literature of Christianity from later generations, it's said that Paul's most prominent companions, like Thecla, were women. That we see the Virgin Mary's prominence from the very first generation, not only in the Gospels but in the other documents of the early church. So we see women play this outsized role, and in the wider culture at that time, women did not have rights. Women were treated like perpetual children. They were not allowed to testify in a court of law because their testimony was considered unreliable as witnesses. So yeah, this is different. Christianity provides something different because women have a prominence. They have an important role. They receive the same mysteries as men, and they even become celebrities in ways that men did not. If you think about ancient epics, like the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Aeneid, right? The important figures are always men. The heroes are always men, right? And the men become heroes by eviscerating other men. And we have these lurid descriptions of the viscera of men being torn out of their bodies, right? But in Christianity, it was a different case. And so many of the epic heroes of Christianity were women, right? And I mean not only the women of the first generation, like the Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene and Priscilla and others, but also the martyrs, right? Because we have in the 100s, we have martyrs like Blandina, who died in Lyon in France, and they're presented as epic heroes of early Christianity. People to emulate, who show courage, who show all of these virtues that men are supposed to have, and they are the great inspiration. My favorite is probably Perpetua, who is martyred, just after the year 200. So again, very early in Christian history, and we see that she, not her parish priest, is the leader in the Christian community in jail. It's not that she's confecting the sacraments. She's not. But we don't have that role being made the be-all and end-all in that period. She is a charismatic figure. She is the one God grants visions. She is the one who's giving counsel to the others who are about to face martyrdom and encouraging them. Perpetua's book, written then, became an instant bestseller and was transmitted everywhere in the known world. We start to see images of Perpetua in distant Italy shortly after that. So she becomes something of a celebrity in that time. As Christianity goes forward and becomes legal in the 4th century, we see women emerge in this prominent role in society. Women are the founders of monasteries. Women are the founders of hospitals. Women are the founders of schools. And this is taking place, as soon as it's possible. Many of the figures of the 4th century and 5th century, important figures in the development of church institutions, are women. We mentioned earlier Basil and Gregory. Well, we know their female family members played important roles in the development of the church in Caesarea in their time. This is an amazing phenomenon that is too little brought up in our preaching, in our teaching, in our history, but it's something we really should come to appreciate, because it's in that Christian world that for the first time women begin to emerge as cultural leaders. I defy you to tell me the name of another important woman writer in Latin from the early 3rd century. You can't. You can't even find an unimportant woman writer writing in Latin in the early 3rd century. Perpetua is a sign of the revolution.
I I bought that book. I think yesterday, coming across it because I've got a 7-year-old daughter who
Good for you.
she's looking around and she sees male-dominated sports and other things, and it's like, no, you've got heroines. They're around, and so we'll read you these stories when we get them. So and I think it's really important, because there's so much of it. You were saying a fixation on the sanctuary, as if the
Mhm.
be all and end all of being a Catholic is somehow the closer you can get to the altar,
That kind
regardless
of
of worthiness.
clericalism, that
Yeah.
kind of clericalism is absent from the early church. It
Hmm.
begins to happen in the time of Theodosius, and we find important figures like Chrysostom and Augustine decrying it. They describe it and they decry it. I think we're still living in the aftermath of Theodosius's victory.
Hmm. Yeah. The sooner we wake up to that, the better, because then we can all get on with sanctifying the world in our own capacity. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. You've said that the liturgy is the interpretative key for the scriptures in the early church. Can you please expand on this? Like, how was it that within the liturgy, the scriptures made sense?
Well, it is the context for much of what we have in terms of scriptural commentary from the early church. So much of it comes from the preaching of the early fathers, and it was liturgical preaching. So it often refers to the mysteries that were the immediate setting for that sermon, for that homily, for that commentary, what was going on. So yeah, I think that if you don't understand the liturgy as it was practiced in the early church and as it's still practiced today, you don't really know what's going on in those documents. And I think that it was that way from the beginning. There's plenty of evidence in the documents of the New Testament that they were written anticipating liturgical proclamation in the context of the Eucharistic liturgy specifically, sometimes a baptismal liturgy as well.
Your colleague Scott Hahn talks about the book of Revelation being basically a liturgical commentary. So in that sense, it's this one book that I suppose many of us find indecipherable, perhaps can be made sense of when read within a liturgical context. Would you
Yes.
agree?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And this isn't any secret. A lot of people are saying this. Even great Protestant scholars like N.T. Wright are saying that the Eucharist and the and baptism are really the keys to understanding the Book of Revelation and the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament. That it's impossible to really understand these things apart from a sense of how the liturgy was celebrated in that first generation.
Speaking of heaven, you've also written a book on the angels, and so I was hoping you could talk about what role the angels play in our lives, and how are they different to the cherubs that we see in Renaissance paintings.
Well, I'll start from there. It's angels are pure spirits, right? So they have no appearance, and we try to communicate certain things about angels in the way that we portray them. Sometimes our portrayals are based on details of scriptural accounts. So sometimes in scripture, angels are shown with wings. So we tend to give angels wings. Sometimes they have a somewhat human appearance, and so we tend to give them a somewhat human appearance. Now, why do we show angels as chubby babies with stubby wings? I don't know. One is by making them attractive to us. Babies are attractive. What do you want to? You see a baby, you want to pick the baby up, right? It's the way they are. Okay, so that's one reason. Another is by showing their innocence. That a baby is someone completely innocent, and angels are innocent. They've proven their loyalty to God, and they don't sin. And so on. A lot of these portrayals are just our best effort at conveying ideas about angels. But angels are pure spirits. We tend to be materialists. We tend to be physicalists. We tend to think what you see is what you get. And if you don't see something, you don't get it. But if we read the Bible, both the Old Testament and the New, we see that angels are an important part of the fabric of reality. even though we can't measure them in any way. That God is constantly sending his messengers to do his will. The word angel simply means messenger. And this is constantly happening in the Old Testament. The fathers of the church believe that it's happening from the very first line of the Old Testament, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? Well, everything was void and without form. So the earth, as we know it, didn't exist. It was just the stuff of the earth. Well, what's the stuff of heaven? The stuff of heaven is the pure spirits. It's the angels. God created the angels from the beginning. He said, let there be light. And St. Augustine points out that there were no material lights at that point. There was no sun. There was no moon. Certainly no street lamps. So what does it mean when it says God said, let there be light? It means the creation of the angels. And God separated the light from the darkness. He tested the angels and separated the good ones from the evil ones, right? So much of the commentary of the fathers on Scripture it shows an awareness of angels at every point in the human story and in salvation history. So my books have been a plea for us to recover that sense of the omnipresence of angels in the scriptural record. And to learn from that scriptural record, what do we learn? Well, we learn that angels are constantly ascending and descending on that ladder, just as Jacob saw them, right? They're constantly trafficking between heaven and earth. Jesus himself confirmed this when he said that each and every one of us has a guardian angel who watches us while beholding the face of God. So we need to learn about these angels because God has given each and every one of us an angel to be our companion through life, from conception through death and beyond. This angel is closer to us than any family member will ever be, and this angel is smarter than 100 Einsteins. This angel is stronger than the combined offensive and defensive lines of the Pittsburgh Steelers on a good Sunday, right? And God created this angel to serve me. That's this angel's purpose in life. That's his job, right? And so I'm very important to this angel. Reading the scriptures makes us aware of this so that we're living in relationship with the angels as we should. You know, if we look at the prophets in the Old Testament, if we look at figures like Hagar, they lived in relationship with their angels to very good effect. And this is true in the New Testament as well. We see that Jesus was attended by angels in the wilderness. We see that Jesus was comforted by an angel in the Garden of Gethsemane. So all of these, all of this evidence leads me to believe that I should be in relationship with my angel. Saint Augustine used the word amicizia, friendship, to describe the relationship that we should have with our angels. And that's the running theme in my books about angels. I've written 3 books on angels.
Yeah, in this in the present, we see evil proliferating around us in a lot of places. So the rise of the occult and the return of, you would say, demons, fallen angels. And so it's important, I think, when you talk about angels, well, they're a counterforce.
Yes.
It's not that we're alone at the mercy of demons. We have angels, good angels.
That's right.
By our side and ready to be called upon, because they're the Lord's army. They're the hosts. And so I think you're right. There's a forgetfulness that Christianity has had with regard to angels, but it's not a bad thing to be reminded of them.
Absolutely. You know, that there is spiritual warfare. It goes on, and it's personal and it's cosmic. We're part of a very big story, and you and I are an important part of that story. God has called us into being, and he has given us a role to play in history.
You've mentioned St. Augustine a couple of times, a great North African father. And so I'd like to take us to the Arab invasion of North Africa in the 7th and 8th centuries, which wiped out basically Christian North Africa. Now, you've written a book on that, and I was hoping you could tell us more about Christian North Africa and what contribution it made to the faith.
Well, I think its contribution is so important that that we should recognize that we, especially in the West, are African Christians every bit as much as we're Latin Christians or Roman Catholics, because so much of our heritage, our style of Christianity has come from Africa. Everybody knows that St. Augustine came from Africa, right? And he was one of the great fathers of the church, probably the greatest of the fathers of the church, in my opinion. He was the greatest. But he's such an important figure in the development of Western Christianity that even the reformers felt that they needed to claim Augustine for themselves. Calvin and Luther try to make the case that Augustine was a Calvinist or a Lutheran, right? And he's that important, so that if he was the only Christian ever to come from Africa, we would all look to him as one of the most important formative figures in our own makeup, in our own Christianity. But he's not the only one. You know, I've been talking about a lot of other Christians as we go along here, African Christians. I quoted Tertullian early on. He's the one who said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. He's somebody who's quoted all the time. There's also Perpetua. She was a North African Christian, right? The same thing with Cyprian. And then you go on from there. There's Lactantius and Arnobius and so many others who made the way for Augustine. They precede Augustine, and there were others who came after Augustine. So there are these very important figures in our makeup. Our heritage, our inheritance is what we call the Mass, the Latin liturgy. Okay, even though we don't celebrate it in Latin in my parish, the liturgy still has the same form as it had in Rome in the 4th century. But you know what? The Latin liturgy that was celebrated in Rome in the 4th century was earlier celebrated in North Africa, and it made its way to Rome eventually. Until the 4th century, the church in Rome was offering its liturgy in Greek, okay, because that was the universal language in the early years of Christianity. So it's from North Africa that we get our style of worship, our ways of worship, our categories for thinking about the faith. You know, Tertullian gave us important terms to use in our theology, like Trinity, like sacrament. These realities were there in the earlier writings, especially of the Greek fathers. It's Tertullian who gives us the Latin terms for these realities. So much of what we have and know as Latin Christianity comes to us from African Christians. So yeah, I think deep down, we're all African Christians, and we need to come to appreciate that.
You've spoken about the role of the angels in helping Christians along, and also Mary has had a recurring role throughout history. So I was hoping you could tell us about Mary's help in preserving Byzantium during the rise of Islam, as well as the military victories of Lepanto and Vienna.
I hardly know where to begin. Mary is so important in helping us to preserve the faith from age to age. And I've written a couple books trying to demonstrate that. She really does change the character of a church. She really does kind of make the Christian house a home. You know, I believe that that's why she appears the way she does in the Bible. She's such an important figure in the Gospels. When the Gentiles want to see Jesus, right? When the Magi come to see Jesus, they find him with his mother, right? That's an important detail that the Gospel gives us. They find him with his mother. It's she who made a home for those who would be disciples. She herself was the model disciple, the first disciple, because we can see from the Gospels that she followed after him in the difficult life that he led as an itinerant preacher. What else do we see? We see that she intercedes on the behalf of other people. We see that at the wedding feast at Cana, and that Jesus is even willing to advance his time frame in order to please his mother, to do something for his mother. Because she asks for a miracle, he says that his hour has not yet come, and he does it anyway. Right? He follows through anyway. We go through the rest of the Gospels, we find that she was there at the center of the household of faith in the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles. She's there when the Holy Spirit comes down in Luke's second book, the Acts, just as she was there in Luke's first book, the Gospel. Right? The Holy Spirit comes down in both cases to launch the book. And Mary is part of the story from the beginning. At the end of the New Testament, we see in the 12th chapter of St. John's Revelation that Mary is there as Queen of Heaven, and she's still there tending to God's other offspring. God's other offspring, other than Jesus, his younger brothers. Who are his younger brothers? Well, that's all of us, right? And these are her other offspring. I am her other offspring. When Jesus was dying on the cross, he told his beloved disciple, "Behold your mother." We're never told the name of the beloved disciple, though tradition tells us it was John, the author of the gospel. So why don't we get his name? Well, because he wanted us to imagine ourselves as the beloved disciple in that scene. Mary makes the church a home. Without Mary, the church is just a bachelor apartment. When Mary is there, Mom is home. Mom is setting the table. And it's a beautiful thing. And she has enabled the church to endure through so many times of persecution, through so many times of challenges, through so many times of lukewarmness among Christians. She has inspired the saints. This has been part of our history in every age, and she shows herself in a different way in every period according to the needs of the people. When people need to see the majestic lady, because that's how they look to a queen in the Byzantine Empire, well, she shows herself to be a Byzantine empress, and it's a beautiful thing in the icons. When her people are suffering, in times of plague in the Middle Ages, when such a great percentage of Europe was wiped out, sometimes entire villages wiped out by plague, Mary shows herself in the Pietà, right? And the Pietà becomes the dominant form of art for that period. In every age, Mary is this galvanizing force in the church. She's mom. She's the mother in the church, and she makes the church what it is. Jesus, it is, who put her there, who made it that way. If I'm going to say that Jesus is my brother, if I'm going to say that God is my father, if I'm going to say that heaven is my home, then I have to say that Mary is my mother. That Jesus and I were, in a sense, born from the same womb. That Jesus and I are in the same family, at the same table, in the same place, and we both look to her. It's a beautiful thing. I think that people essentially misunderstand Marian devotion in so many ways, and they make it into something that it's not. Mary is not an idol. She's not a goddess. She is the first disciple. She's a model disciple, and she is mother. We call her Mother of God because it was her privilege, her honor to mother God.
Yeah, she has the maternal aspect for sure. What I find kind of curious is that as the new Ark of the Covenant, there is a military role for the Ark in the Old Testament. It leads Israel into battle, and if she's the new Ark of the Covenant, then she also leads Christians at least into spiritual battle. I mean, when I mention Lepanto and Vienna, they're military fights, but in the same sense as we were talking about the angels before being at our side in spiritual battle, we also have our mother up the front, kind of whacking these demons left and right, let's say, on behalf of her son, on behalf of us. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, there is, as you probably know, there has been um, an uptick in demonic possession in recent years, and there's been an uptick in the demand for deliverance, for exorcism, and exorcists report that often, almost always, at the end of the process, when someone is being delivered, the moment of deliverance, they report being comforted, being welcomed by a beautiful young woman. And this is even the case when it's non-Catholics, non-Christians being delivered from demonic possession, that they see Mary in the end. And I think that Mary does represent the arrival of victory. And that's what you see, again, consistently in history, when the soldiers, so to speak, fight under her banner, that when they have pure intentions going into battle, when they're doing it for the right reasons, Mary assures a victory. And I think that even when motives have been mixed, Mary brought about the victory, as she did in South and Central America with her appearance at Guadalupe, when she identified with the poor and with the marginalized.
Coming towards the close of our interview, you've helped lead a number of pilgrimages in Italy, Greece, Turkey, and the Holy Land. I was wondering if you could tell us what your favorite site is, favorite country, as well as what people should keep in mind if they're planning a pilgrimage overseas. Just some practical tips.
My favorite site is probably Ostia Antica, which is the port city of Rome, the ancient port city of Rome. It's no longer a port city, but it's just a quick train ride from downtown Rome, and you get there, and it's now a national park. It's an archaeological park. The city fell into disuse in the years after the fall of Rome because they did not have the slave labor to dredge the harbor, and so the harbor filled in. It became dry land, and the town silted over. So it's only in the last 75 years or so that there have been extensive excavations there. And the excavations have brought up a town that's pretty much intact. So you can go through and walk through the fish market and see what was there, go into a tavern and see what was there. You could even see the places where they made change behind the bar. Okay, because there are slots for different sized coins. You can go to the 4th century basilica and worship God there. So much of the city is available for you. And I talked earlier about the need we have for an imaginative entry into the ancient world. That's my imaginative entry. When you go to visit the Colosseum, it's this anomaly. It's this 1st century structure that's in the middle of a major interchange in a city, in a modern city. It's a strange thing. Traffic is whizzing by you, and there are buses pulling up and everything. But if you go to Ostia Antica, you have a better sense of the ancient city as it was constructed. You could walk its roads. You could still see the pottery that's on the ground around you, the broken pottery shards. It's amazing. Now, St. Augustine spends time in his Confessions describing Ostia, and his mother died at Ostia. And so the most dramatic scene in the Confessions is his mother's death and the moments leading up to it. And I always read those on site there at Ostia, and follow along with Augustine in the moments afterward when he went to the baths. Well, the baths are still standing in Ostia. You can go there. You can go to the place where Monica's rites were, her funeral rites. Ostia is the city where the Octavius took place, of Minucius Felix, another document that I mentioned earlier in the show. So you can read these things on site, and it's a powerful experience. And it gives you, as I said, that imaginative entry into the world. That's my favorite site.
And do you think people should take tours or travel solo, or what's the best way of kind of visiting these places?
I think tours can be helpful. I've walked behind some tour guides though, that have have been dispensing misinformation, right? Even though they're certified guides and they're not supposed to do that. I've seen that happen on these sites. So uh, you have to fortify yourself with your own research. Find out the importance of the places where you're visiting. Do some research in advance. Do some reading. Find out what really went on there, and then go over. I think it can be helpful to have a local guide. It helps if you can find out in advance. Does your local guide, find out? You do what you would do for a restaurant, right? Look up the reviews and find out what other people say about certain guides, and see if you can get some referrals from experienced pilgrims.
Very good. And finally, where can people find your books and read more about you? What sites can they visit?
Best place to find my books if you're looking at price is catholicbooksdirect.com, catholicbooksdirect.com. They usually have the best price, and they usually have all my books together. But my own website is fathersofthechurch.com, fathersofthechurch.com. So
very good. And just for those watching us, if you could like, share, and subscribe this content, that will help us grow as a channel and we can get more wonderful guests like Mike on. Thanks, Mike, so much for joining us. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you. From Pittsburgh in the United States, Mike Aquilina, everyone, thank you very much.
It's been an honor to do this. Thanks for inviting me.